It was 6:47 in the morning when Donovan Hale walked through the glass doors of Meridian Capital Group, and the security guard told him to use the service entrance. He didn't argue. He just nodded, turned around, and walked back out into the October cold. That detail matters. Remember it. Donovan Hale was 41 years old. He wore a brown canvas jacket that had seen better decades, work boots with dried mud on the left heel, and a backpack that looked like it belonged to someone's kid. He had the kind of face that people described as friendly when they were being polite and forgettable when they weren't. He was black. He was broad-shouldered in a way that made expensive suits look wrong on him, which was one reason he rarely wore them. His hair needed a shape-up. He knew that. He hadn't gotten around to it. He was also, as of 9 days prior, the newly appointed Chief Investment Officer of Meridian Capital Group, a firm managing $4.2 billion in assets across 14 states. But the security guard didn't know that, and so Donovan used the service entrance. He took the freight elevator to the 23rd floor. He stood in the elevator with a cart full of breakfast pastries being delivered by a catering company, and he held the door for the young man pushing it. The young man said thank you. Donovan said no problem. The elevator smelled like cinnamon and cleaning solution. He was carrying a black composition notebook. Not a laptop, not a leather portfolio. A composition notebook, the kind you could buy 3 for $5 at any drugstore. He'd been using them since graduate school at Wharton and saw no reason to stop. The 23rd floor was already busy when he stepped off. Meridian's trading and analysis division took up the entire floor. Rows of monitors, the low hum of Bloomberg terminals, the particular tension that settles over financial offices in the hour before markets open. People moved fast. No one looked up. Donovan found an empty chair at the end of a long conference table near the windows. He sat down, opened his notebook, and started writing. The first person to say something was a man named Cliff Beaumont. Cliff was 34, a senior portfolio analyst who had been at Meridian for 6 years, and had in those 6 years developed the kind of confidence that gets mistaken for competence often enough to become dangerous. He wore cufflinks on a Tuesday. He had strong opinions about espresso. He walked past the conference table, stopped, looked at Donovan, and said, "Can I help you?" The way he said it was not the way you say it when you want to help someone. Donovan looked up from his notebook. "No, I'm fine, thanks." Cliff looked at the notebook, looked at the backpack, looked at the work boots. "This floor is for Meridian employees only. Are you with maintenance?" "I'm not. Vetter check-in is on 12. "I know," Donovan said. "I've been to the building before." Cliff waited for more. Donovan didn't offer more. He went back to writing. Cliff stood there for another 3 seconds. That specific loaded 3 seconds of someone deciding whether to push further or let it go. And then he walked away. He stopped at the desk of a colleague named Patrick Sway, said something quietly, and Patrick glanced over at the conference table. Donovan wrote a note in his composition notebook. Beaumont, Cliff, senior analyst, 6 yours. Reads body language as hierarchy. Watch. By 8:15, 4 more people had approached him. A woman named Greta Howell from HR Plus asked if he was there for the IT setup appointment and seemed confused when he said no. A young associate named Brennan asked if the chair was free in a tone that suggested he hoped the answer was yes, so Donovan would have to leave. A man in his 50s whose name tag read Harold. Facilities actually brought him a visitor badge and said he'd need to wear it while on the floor. Donovan clipped the visitor badge to his jacket. He didn't make a scene. He just wrote everything down. The only person who didn't approach him was a woman named Yuki Tanaka, a quantitative analyst in the corner office, who glanced over once, made eye contact, nodded slightly, and went back to her screens. That detail also mattered. He wrote her name down too, but he drew a small circle around it instead of a line. At 8:47, a man came striding across the floor like he owned it, which, in a certain sense, he believed he did. His name was Ridley Stratton. Ridley was the outgoing CIO, the man Donovan was replacing. He was 52, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that had worked well for him for 30 years. He was leaving Meridian for a position in London, a fact he mentioned in every conversation, as though it were a title. He stopped at the conference table, looked at Donovan, and his expression did something complicated. "Who authorized you to be in here?" he said. "No hello, no introduction, just that." Donovan set down his pen. "I authorized myself." Ridley blinked. "Excuse me. I'm sorry, you are." The question landed strangely because it was clear from Ridley's posture that he was not accustomed to being the one asked to identify himself in this building. Ridley Stratton. "I'm the Chief Investment Officer." "Right," Donovan said. "I've read your quarterlies. Solid 21, rough patch in 23. You made some interesting calls on the infrastructure portfolio." He paused. "Some I agreed with, some I didn't." Ridley's jaw shifted slightly. "Who are you?" Donovan didn't answer right away. He looked back at his notebook, wrote one more thing. Then he looked up. "I have a 9 o'clock with the executive team," he said. "You're welcome to join if you want." He picked up his backpack, tucked the composition notebook under his arm, and walked toward the conference room at the end of the hall. Ridley Stratton stood at the table and watched him go. The 9 o'clock meeting was with Marcus Holt, Meridian's CEO, and the 6-member executive committee. It had been scheduled for 2 weeks. Every person in that room knew who was walking through the door. Every person except those ones on the 23rd floor who hadn't thought to check. Donovan walked in, shook hands, poured himself coffee from the credenza, and sat at the head of the table. Not because anyone directed him there, but because it was the logical seat and he understood logistics. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. He spent the first 20 minutes listening, the next 40 asking questions, specific, precise questions about the infrastructure holdings, the fixed income exposure, the talent pipeline in the quantitative division, the kind of questions that require either deep familiarity with the firm's internal data or a photographic memory for the materials sent to him over the past 9 days. He had both. Marcus Holt watched him work and said almost nothing for the first hour, which was unusual for Marcus. The other committee members began to calibrate themselves to Donovan's rhythm, answering more carefully, pulling up additional data when he asked, double-checking figures before stating them. This was how Donovan Hale had always worked. He made rooms get more precise simply by being in them. At 11:20, Marcus called a break. He walked over to Donovan and said quietly, "I heard there was some confusion on the floor this morning." "Not from my end," Donovan said. Marcus looked at him. "You're not going to make a thing of it?" "I already made a thing of it," Donovan said. He tapped the composition notebook sitting on the table beside his coffee cup. "I just did it quietly." The announcement went out at noon. A company-wide email from Marcus Holt. Meridian Capital Group is pleased to announce the appointment of Donovan Hale as Chief Investment Officer, effective immediately. Donovan brings 20 years of portfolio management experience, including his tenure as managing director at Caldwell Partners and his recent advisory role with the Federal Reserve's Financial Stability Board. Please join us in welcoming Donovan to the leadership team. The 23rd floor got quiet in a specific way. The kind of quiet that happens when 47 people simultaneously realize they've been starring in a story they misread. Cliff Beaumont read the email twice. He pulled up Donovan Hale on LinkedIn. He sat back in his chair and looked at his cufflinks for a long moment. Patrick Sway stood up from his desk, looked across the floor toward the conference room, sat back down. Greta Howell from HR sent an email that began, "I want to sincerely apologize for any confusion this morning," and then deleted it and started over 3 times before finally sending a shorter version that she wasn't happy with either. Brennan, the young associate who'd asked about the chair, told a colleague that he hadn't realized who it was, which was true, and which was also the point. Ridley Stratton received the email at his desk. He read it. He set his phone face down. He stood up and walked to the window and looked at the Chicago skyline for a very long time. He had read Donovan's work. He just hadn't connected the name to the man in the brown canvas jacket. He asked himself why not. He knew the answer. He just didn't like it. The composition notebook. Later, weeks later, when this story had already spread through certain corners of the financial industry, the way these things do. People kept asking about the notebook. What was in it? During those 3 hours on the 23rd floor, before the 9 o'clock meeting, before the announcement, during all those interactions where people told him where to go, and what he couldn't have, and what floor he needed to be on. Donovan Hale had been writing. Not complaints, not a grievance list, not names for HR. An organizational analysis. He wrote down what he observed, who managed upward, who deferred without thinking, who assumed authority from appearance rather than information. He wrote down the gaps he noticed in how the floor operated, communication bottlenecks, siloed decision-making, a culture where junior employees looked to senior employees for cues rather than reasoning through problems themselves. He wrote down Yuki Tanaka's name in a circle because she was the only person on the floor who had looked at an unknown person and chosen curiosity over suspicion, which told him something about how she processed information. He had done this at every firm he'd ever worked at. He called it a cold read, walk in unknown. See what the system does when it doesn't know who you are. He'd learned more about Meridian's organizational culture in 3 hours that morning than he could have gathered from 6 months of performance reviews. In his first week as CIO, Donovan Hale called individual meetings with 23 members of the firm. Yuki Tanaka's meeting was first. 40 minutes. She brought 3 years of quantitative models she'd been running independently, work she hadn't formally presented, because the previous CIO's culture didn't reward unsolicited analysis. Donovan read through all of it on the spot, asked 4 questions, and then told her he was creating a new internal research group, and he wanted her to lead it. She asked why her. He said because when you saw someone you didn't recognize, sitting in a chair, your first instinct was to nod and let them be. That's a person who deals in data, not assumptions. She didn't know what to say to that. She wrote it down. Cliff Beaumont's meeting was the 11th. He walked in clearly prepared to apologize, which Donovan didn't encourage or discourage. He let Cliff say what he needed to say, and then he set it aside and asked about Cliff's read on the infrastructure holdings, the same holdings Donovan had mentioned to Ridley Stratton that first morning. Cliff knew the portfolio well. When he stopped performing contrition and started talking shop, he was sharper than his file suggested. Donovan noted that, too, in the composition notebook. A circle, not a line. Not everyone got a circle. Ridley Stratton left for London 6 weeks after Donovan's first day. At his send-off, a low-key reception in the 31st floor boardroom, sparkling wine and a sheet cake from the same bakery that did every Meridian send-off. Ridley found Donovan near the window. There was a moment between them. The kind of moment where everything that needs to be said is already known by both parties, and the question is only whether anyone is going to say it out loud. Ridley said, "I wasn't expecting you to look like that. It was an honest thing to say." Donovan respected honesty, even when it was uncomfortable. "I know," Donovan said. "I should have." Ridley stopped, started again. "I've been in this industry for almost 30 years. I'd like to think I'm not the kind of person who—" He stopped again. Donovan looked out at the skyline. "What did you think when you first saw me sitting at that table?" Ridley was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were in the wrong place. And what do you think now?" A longer pause. Outside, a commuter train moved silently along the elevated track, lit from within, a bright ribbon through the gray afternoon. "I think," Ridley said carefully, "that I made an assumption and I was wrong, and I've been sitting with that." "Good," Donovan said. "Sit with it a little longer." He picked up his plate. He went and talked to someone else. "There's a question worth sitting with, now that you know how this ends." Donovan Hale walked into a building where he was the most senior investment professional in the room. He was asked to use the service entrance. He was handed a visitor badge by the facilities team. He was questioned, redirected, and looked at like something out of place, not once but repeatedly, across 3 hours by multiple people. And his response was to open a composition notebook and write everything down. Not to announce himself, not to produce his credentials like a rebuttal, not to demand a different experience. He let the room tell him exactly who it was. That's the part people kept returning to afterward. Not the announcement email, Not Ridley's face when he read it. Not even Cliff Beaumont sitting alone at his desk, staring at his cufflinks. They kept returning to the notebook. Because there's a difference between power that has to announce itself and power that simply waits. Donovan Hale had spent 20 years learning that difference. He knew what happened to black men in expensive suits who walked into rooms demanding to be seen. They got performance, not truth. They got people showing them what they wanted the firm to look like, not what it actually was. He wanted to see what it actually was. And that Tuesday morning, in those 3 hours before the world of the 23rd floor rearranged itself around a single email, he got exactly that. The notebook is still in his top desk drawer. He started a second one. The question isn't whether what happened to Donovan Hale was wrong. It was. The question is what you do with that wrongness. Do you burn the house down in the first 5 minutes? Or do you take notes until you know exactly which walls are load-bearing? Think about that. Think about which one you would choose, and then ask yourself which one actually changes something.